The sound of tires rolling over gravel cut through the stillness of the evening as Marcus Ellison, a 45-year-old man with a composed demeanor and a reputation for leadership, turned onto Sycamore Avenue. After a long but rewarding day spent meeting with community leaders in Charlotte, North Carolina, he was finally heading home. His mind wandered to the warmth of his living room and the slow-cooked roast his wife had waiting for him. Then out of nowhere, red and blue lights flickered in his rearview mirror. His stomach clenched slightly, but his expression remained steady. He instinctively checked his speedometer. 29 and a 35. No violations, no broken taillights. And yet the wailing siren behind him made it clear he had no choice. Stay calm, he muttered to himself as he flipped on his turn signal and eased the car onto the shoulder. His hands remained visible on the steering wheel, movements deliberate. It was a routine he had perfected, not because he had done anything wrong, but because in these situations, appearances were everything. A patrol car pulled up behind him. The first officer approached briskly, flashlight in hand, its harsh beam cutting into the dimly lit interior. Another officer lingered near the rear bumper, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You in a hurry tonight?" The first cop's voice was sharp, edged with suspicion. "No, sir," Marcus replied evenly. His tone was calm but firm. "Just heading home." The flashlight hovered on Marcus's face a beat too long before darting to the console, the glove compartment, and then back to his eyes. "License and registration," the officer demanded. Marcus nodded and moved slowly, narrating every motion. "I'm reaching into my glove compartment for my registration. My license is in my wallet. I'll get that next." The officer remained silent, but his posture stiffened. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked, though it didn't sound like a question. Before Marcus could respond, the officer continued. "You were driving erratically." Swerving into the other lane. Marcus frowned slightly. "With all due respect, sir, I wasn't swerving. My dash cam can verify that." The officer's eyes flickered with irritation. "Dash cam, huh? That'll be confiscated for evidence. Step out of the vehicle." Marcus blinked. The sudden escalation caught him off guard. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I've complied fully." The officer's jaw tightened. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Marcus's stomach tightened, but his face remained composed. He unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door slowly, his hands raised in clear view. The second officer moved in immediately, gripping Marcus's arm and yanking him toward the squad car. "Is this necessary?" Marcus asked, his voice measured but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." "Resisting, huh?" the first officer sneered. "You want to play that game? Fine by me." The cold steel of handcuffs clamped down on Marcus's wrists, the metal biting into his skin. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay composed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was profiling, plain and simple. As the officers shoved him into the back seat of the squad car, Marcus glanced down the street. A few neighbors peeked through their blinds, their silhouettes framed by porch lights. No one stepped outside. No one said a word. This was far from over. The patrol car rattled as it rolled down the street, Marcus sitting stiffly in the back seat. He stared out the window, watching familiar landmarks blur past. His mind wasn't on the scenery. It was trying to process the absurdity of what had just happened. Up front, the two officers exchanged casual banter, as if they hadn't just unlawfully detained a man. The younger one, Officer Daniels, glanced back through the rearview mirror. "So what's your story? Late-night drug run? Or you just like giving us a hard time?" Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "I'm just a man trying to get home." "Yeah, sure." The second officer, a stocky man named Officer Reed, snorted. "We hear that all the time. Reckless drivers always have an excuse." Marcus bit his tongue. Arguing wouldn't help. He took a deep breath, mentally running through his options. He knew his rights. He also knew that in this moment, the odds were stacked against him. The precinct was sterile and fluorescent lit, a stark contrast to the quiet evening he had envisioned just minutes ago. Daniels removed Marcus's cuffs with an almost theatrical flourish. "Welcome to our humble abode," he said mockingly. "You're going to be here for a while." "Am I being charged?" Marcus asked, rubbing his wrists. Reed smirked. "We'll let you know once we figure that out. Sit tight." Marcus was led into a small, cold holding cell. The door clanged shut behind him, the echo lingering in the air. He sat on the hard bench, hands clasped, posture steady. Outside, the two officers leaned against the desk, reviewing his license and registration. Nothing out of the ordinary, Daniels said, sounding almost disappointed. Doesn't matter, Reed replied with a smirk. We'll find something. Guys like him always have skeletons in the closet. Marcus overheard their exchange. His face remained unreadable. He wasn't angry. He was calculating. Patience, he reminded himself. It would pay off soon enough. The cold metal bench pressed against Marcus Ellison's back as he sat in the holding cell, watching the precinct buzz with activity. The hours stretched endlessly, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of papers and distant conversations. Despite the stillness around him, his mind was anything but calm. He replayed the night's events like a film reel, every sharp word, every unnecessary escalation. It all served as a stark reminder of the deep flaws in the system he had spent years fighting to fix. His new position as police chief was supposed to be an opportunity to create change from within, to establish a culture of accountability. And now here he was, experiencing firsthand the very injustice he had sworn to eradicate. Footsteps echoed down the hall, snapping him out of his thoughts. A woman with an air of authority approached his cell, her expression unreadable. Lieutenant Sarah Morgan, her badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Unlike the other officers, she carried herself with professionalism, her sharp eyes scanning Marcus before shifting to the clipboard in her hands. "What's going on here?" she asked. Officer Daniels stepped forward, his voice casual. "Picked him up last night for reckless driving and resisting arrest." Morgan arched an eyebrow. "Reckless driving? Where's the evidence?" "We haven't processed it yet," Reed chimed in, arms crossed, leaning lazily against the desk. Morgan's jaw tightened. "Let me get this straight. You arrested a man, detained him overnight, and you haven't even reviewed the evidence?" Her voice was controlled, but the edge was unmistakable. Reed shrugged. "We were getting to it." Morgan exhaled sharply, clearly unimpressed. She turned back to Marcus, her expression shifting slightly. "Sir, do you have any idea why you were stopped?" Marcus stood, meeting her gaze with the same calm he had maintained all night. "I was told it was for reckless driving, which I categorically deny. I also have a dash cam that can verify my version of events." Morgan's eyes flicked toward the officers, who suddenly looked far less confident. "You didn't review his dash cam?" she asked. Daniels hesitated. "We didn't get to it yet." Morgan's expression hardened. "Get it now. And Daniels, Reed, my office. Now." As the two officers slunk away, Marcus knew the tide was beginning to turn. The precinct felt different now, quieter, heavier. Other officers moved through the space, casting cautious glances his way. Some looked confused, others merely curious. None of them recognized him. He wasn't surprised. He had only been appointed 3 weeks ago. Marcus sat back on the cold bench, letting the minutes drag by. He wasn't in a rush. This was no longer about him. It was about what came next. He had spent too many years watching situations like this play out. He knew exactly how it would go. Officers like Daniels and Reed rarely faced real consequences, but this time, things would be different. The sound of footsteps brought his attention back to the present. Morgan returned, holding a tablet. She gestured for him to step closer to the bars. "We reviewed your dash cam footage," she said, her tone clipped but professional. "I've also spoken with the arresting officers. Let me be clear, this should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely." Marcus raised an eyebrow. He wasn't surprised, but he waited for her to continue. "I'm releasing you immediately," she added, "but I'd like to discuss next steps, privately." Moments later, Marcus was out of the cell and seated across from Morgan in her office. The room was stark. A simple desk, a couple of chairs, a small filing cabinet. No distractions, just business. Morgan folded her hands on the desk. "I need to ask, who are you, really? You're far too composed for someone who just spent the night in a holding cell for no reason." Marcus leaned back slightly, offering a small, measured smile. "I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant. Let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm. Morgan studied him for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough, but I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll hear of this situation. As Marcus left the precinct, the early morning sun warmed his face, but the weight of the night lingered on his shoulders. He didn't go straight home. Instead, he drove to his office, parked in his reserved space, and walked through the doors of the police headquarters he now oversaw. Inside, his assistant, Anita, looked up from her desk, startled. Chief Ellison, you're here early. Marcus gave her a nod, his expression unreadable. It's been a long night. Anita hesitated. Do you need me to? I need you to prepare a briefing room, he said. I need to address the department this afternoon. Anita nodded quickly, sensing the gravity in his voice. As Marcus stepped into his office and closed the door behind him, he exhaled deeply. He knew what was coming. This wasn't just about him. It was about what his experience represented. The public trusted him to lead, to protect, to hold others accountable. That responsibility weighed heavily, but he welcomed it. And before he could act, there was one more storm to weather. The courtroom. If you've made it this far, comment 1, so I know you're still here. Marcus sat in silence, his mind sharp and calculating as he observed the precinct come to life around him. He had been through countless interrogations in his career, but never like this, never from this side of the bars. He was still waiting for the weight of the truth to press down on those responsible. Finally, the sound of approaching footsteps signaled the shift he had been expecting. Lieutenant Morgan returned, this time holding a tablet in one hand and a folder in the other. Her expression was unreadable, but the tension in her shoulders was unmistakable. She gestured for him to step forward. We reviewed your dash cam footage, she said, her voice clipped but measured. I've also spoken with Officers Daniels and Reed. Marcus remained silent, waiting. Morgan exhaled. Let me be clear. This should never have happened. The footage contradicts their report entirely. Her words hung in the air, but Marcus didn't react. He had already known the truth. Now he wanted to see what she would do with it. I'm releasing you immediately, she continued, but I'd like to discuss next steps, privately. A few minutes later, Marcus was seated across from Morgan in her office, the metal handcuffs gone, but the weight of the situation still pressing down. The office was minimal, just a desk, a few chairs, and a filing cabinet. No distractions, no excuses. Morgan studied him, her fingers interlaced on the desk. I need to ask, who are you really? Because you're far too composed for someone who just spent the night in a holding cell for no reason. Marcus leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but his presence unwavering. I appreciate your diligence, Lieutenant. Let's just say I've been in situations like this before. I've learned to stay calm. Morgan held his gaze, then gave a small nod. Fair enough, she said, but I have a feeling this isn't the last we'll hear of this situation. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. Morgan sighed, shifting her focus back to the folder in front of her. I'll be filing a report against Daniels and Reed. There will be an internal investigation. Marcus tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair. And what do you expect that to accomplish? Morgan frowned slightly, caught off guard by the question. They'll be held accountable. Marcus let a beat of silence pass. Accountable, he repeated. How many times have you seen an officer walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist? Morgan's jaw tightened. I won't let that happen. Marcus finally allowed himself a small smile. Good, he said, because I won't either. Morgan leaned back in her chair, clearly processing the weight of the situation. I assume you'll want to file a complaint, she said. Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall. No, he said simply. Morgan's brows furrowed. No? Marcus stood, adjusting his shirt cuffs. I'll handle it myself. Morgan watched as he turned for the door. Mr. Ellison, she called after him. He paused. You never told me, she said. What exactly do you do for a living? Marcus glanced back, his expression unreadable. You'll find out soon enough. He walked out without another word, the precinct buzzing with activity around him. He could feel the shift, the whispered conversations, the glances in his direction, but none of that mattered. He wasn't going home. He was heading to work, and it was time for some long overdue changes. Marcus Ellison walked out of the precinct, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The air was crisp, but the weight of the night still clung to him. He had spent hours locked in a holding cell, not because of anything he had done, but because of the assumptions made about him. And now it was time to set the record straight. Instead of heading home, he turned toward downtown, his hands steady on the wheel as he drove through the quiet streets. The city was waking up, commuters sipping coffee, joggers moving in rhythmic strides along the sidewalks. For them, it was just another morning. For Marcus, it was something else entirely. The parking garage beneath the police headquarters was nearly empty at this hour. He pulled into his reserved spot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. His reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror, calm, composed, and ready. Pushing open the door, he strode through the entrance, nodding briefly at the officer at the front desk, who barely glanced up from his paperwork. It was strange, he thought, how little attention people paid when they assumed they were looking at just another man. That was about to change. Inside, his assistant Anita nearly jumped from her seat when she saw him. "Chief Ellison, you're here early." Marcus gave her a nod. "It's been a long night." She hesitated. "Do you need me to—" "I need you to prepare a briefing room," he said. "I need to address the department this afternoon." Anita's eyes widened slightly, but she recovered quickly, grabbing a notepad and flipping through her schedule. "Of course. Should I notify—" "Everyone," Marcus interrupted. "I want the entire department there." Anita nodded, sensing the gravity in his voice. Marcus turned and walked toward his office, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. He pushed open the heavy wooden door, stepped inside, and let it close behind him. The silence was thick. For a moment, he allowed himself a deep breath, exhaling slowly as he loosened his tie. His gaze fell on the framed commendations lining the walls. The report stacked neatly on his desk. Just 3 weeks ago, he had stepped into this office with a vision to rebuild trust, to bring accountability, to make this department something people could believe in. Now that mission was personal. He moved to his desk, picked up the landline, and dialed. "Get me Lieutenant Morgan," he said, his voice steady. A few moments later, there was a knock at the door. Morgan entered, her face carefully neutral. "Chief." Marcus leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "I assume you've already read the full report?" She nodded. "Daniels and Reed are being placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation." Marcus studied her. "A suspension," he said, his tone unreadable. "For now," Morgan replied, "but their records will be thoroughly reviewed. Their conduct last night wasn't an isolated incident." Marcus let out a slow breath. "No, it wasn't." Morgan hesitated. "I have to ask, why didn't you tell them who you were last night? You could have shut it down in minutes." Marcus's expression didn't change. "And then what? They apologize, I go home, and they do it to someone else tomorrow?" He shook his head. "I needed this to play out exactly the way it did." Morgan held his gaze. "You wanted proof." Marcus gave a small nod. "I wanted to see how deep it ran. And now, I have my answer." She exhaled, shifting on her feet. "What's next?" Marcus straightened. "A department-wide briefing. Every officer, every division. I want them to understand what happened. Not just to me, but what happens to people like me every day." Morgan nodded, understanding. "I'll make sure it happens." As she left, Marcus sat down at his desk, his fingers steepled in thought. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread fast. By the time Marcus Ellison stepped inside, the gallery was filled with reporters, legal observers, and community members who had caught wind of what was happening. Though cameras weren't allowed inside, that didn't stop journalists from lining the courthouse steps, eager to capture the aftermath. Marcus took his seat at the defendant's table, his posture calm, his face unreadable. Across from him, officers Daniels and Reed sat with their department-appointed attorney. Daniels looked uneasy, his foot tapping uncontrollably beneath the table. Reed, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his usual smugness still intact. That wouldn't last long. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, entered and called the session to order. "We're here today to address the charges brought against Marcus Ellison," the judge announced. "Prosecution, you may proceed." A young prosecutor, clearly fresh to the courtroom, stood and adjusted his tie. His voice held a slight tremor as he began outlining the case. On the night in question, the defendant was observed driving recklessly, swerving into another lane, he stated. Upon being stopped by officers Daniels and Reed, he became uncooperative and resisted arrest. At the defense table, Marcus's attorney, Sandra Reyes, barely concealed a smirk. She leaned over and whispered, "They're walking right into it." When it was her turn, Sandra stood confidently, her voice slicing through the tension in the room. "Your Honor, the charges against my client are not only baseless, but they're also the result of racial profiling and abuse of power," she said. "To prove this, I'd like to present video evidence that directly contradicts the officer's statements." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Sandra turned to the bailiff, who dimmed the lights. A projector flickered to life, casting the dashcam footage onto the courtroom screen. The silence was deafening. On the video, Marcus's car could be seen driving steadily, well within his lane, his speedometer reading a constant 29 miles per hour. The patrol car appeared behind him, tailing him for blocks before abruptly activating its lights. The body cam footage followed, showing Daniels and Reed approaching the vehicle. The courtroom listened as their aggressive tone filled the speakers, their impatience evident from the start. Then came the moment that made the air shift. Daniels in the footage muttered under his breath, "Another one of them causing trouble." Reed chuckled, responding, "Figures." A ripple of gas spread through the gallery. The judge's brow furrowed deeply as he glanced toward the officers. Sandra let the footage play until the moment of arrest, Marcus narrating his movements, Daniels cutting him off, Reed yanking him from the car before handcuffing him. The contrast between Marcus's composed demeanor and the officer's hostility was stark. When the video ended, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Sandra turned to the jury, her voice unwavering. "This isn't just an abuse of power," she said. "This is a direct violation of my client's rights, rooted in bias and prejudice." The prosecutor shifted awkwardly. "The officers believed they had probable cause." Sandra cut in sharply. "Probable cause based on what? Driving safely? Following instructions? Or was it the color of his skin?" The judge rapped his gavel lightly. "Let's keep this focused." Miss Reyes Sandra's voice softened, but her words held the same weight. "Your Honor, before we proceed, my client has something to share." Marcus stood. Adjusting his tie, he scanned the room, making brief eye contact with the officers before turning his attention to the judge. "My name is Marcus Ellison," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I am the chief of police for this city." Silence, then murmurs. The weight of his words sank in like a stone dropped into deep water. At the prosecution's table, Daniel's face went pale. Reed's smugness evaporated in an instant. The judge rapped his gavel again, trying to restore order as the room buzzed with tension. Marcus continued. "I was appointed 3 weeks ago to lead this department and address the very issues you've seen here today," he said. "I chose not to disclose my position earlier because I wanted the truth to come out organically, without bias or interference. And now it has." The murmurs grew louder. Reporters furiously scribbled notes, the energy in the room shifting from shock to realization. Daniels and Reed sat frozen, their expressions an unreadable mix of panic and disbelief. The judge cleared his throat. "Given this new information, the court will reconvene after a brief recess." As the gavel struck, Sandra leaned over to Marcus, a slow smile forming. "I'd say that went well." Marcus simply exhaled. It wasn't about how well this went. It was about what came next. The courtroom doors swung open, and within seconds, the media storm began. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and voices overlapped as reporters bombarded Marcus Ellison with questions. He had expected this. The second his true identity had been revealed, the narrative had shifted. This wasn't just a wrongful arrest anymore. It was a scandal, one that would shake the entire police department. "Chief Ellison, do you have a statement about the case?" one reporter called out. Marcus raised a hand, signaling for silence. The crowd stilled, waiting. "This case isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. As a police chief, I'm committed to creating a department that values integrity and fairness. And as a citizen, I'll continue to fight for justice. More questions followed, but Marcus didn't linger. He had more important matters to address. The fallout was swift. By the time Marcus returned to headquarters, the city was already ablaze with discussion. News outlets replayed the footage of his arrest on an endless loop. The dashcam video had gone viral, spreading across social media within hours. Hashtags demanding justice and police reform trended nationwide. The mayor called an emergency meeting, demanding a full review of department policies. Community leaders rallied, calling for stricter oversight and mandatory bias training for officers. Protests formed outside the precinct, not in anger but in determination, a call for real change. Inside the department, tensions ran high. Officers whispered in the hallways, watching as Marcus walked past, his expression unreadable. Some avoided eye contact. Others gave him looks of quiet understanding. By midday, Daniels and Reed had been suspended without pay, pending an internal investigation. Public pressure mounted for their immediate termination, but Marcus knew that removing two officers wouldn't fix a broken system. It was time for something bigger. The briefing room was packed. Every officer in the department had been called in. They filled the seats, lined the walls, stood in the back. Some looked tense, others indifferent. A few, arms crossed, radiated quiet defiance. Marcus stepped to the front. For a moment, he just looked at them, his department, his responsibility. Then he spoke. "What happened to me last night wasn't an isolated incident," he said, scanning the room. "It was a symptom of a larger problem, and as long as I'm chief, I won't tolerate it." The silence was absolute. "We are here to serve and protect," Marcus continued, his voice unwavering, "not to harass and intimidate. If you can't uphold those values, this isn't the place for you." A few officers shifted in their seats. Others held their gazes steady. Marcus let the words settle before he continued. "Effective immediately, this department will undergo major reform. Mandatory de-escalation and bias training will be implemented for all officers. Body cam footage will be reviewed regularly, not just when complaints are filed. Internal affairs will have more oversight, and officers who violate the public trust will be held accountable." He paused, letting that last part sink in. "I know change won't happen overnight. I know some of you are resistant to it. But understand this. Our job is to uphold the law, not to abuse the power that comes with it." A murmur moved through the room, some officers nodding, others still stiff with resistance. But Marcus wasn't looking for unanimous approval. He was looking for accountability. "If you have a problem with any of this, my office door's open," Marcus finished. "But if your issue is with treating the community with the respect they deserve, then you can hand in your badge." With that, he turned and walked out. The department would either adapt or be left behind. The next few weeks were a test. Trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. Community meetings were held, officers faced tougher scrutiny, and Marcus made sure his reforms weren't just empty promises. Complaints were taken seriously. Corrupt officers were removed. Those who resisted change found themselves outnumbered by those who embraced it. Slowly, the shift began. At a town hall meeting, a young man stood up. His voice wavered slightly as he spoke. "Chief Ellison," he said, glancing around the crowded room, "what you went through, it could have been me. It could have been any of us. Thank you for standing up, not just for yourself, but for all of us." Marcus nodded, his heart heavy but full of resolve. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he replied, "but together we can build a system that truly serves everyone." The room filled with quiet applause. Marcus knew the fight wasn't over, but he was ready for it. The air outside the precinct was cool as Marcus Ellison stepped out onto the front steps, the weight of the past few weeks settling on his shoulders. The city had changed since the night of his arrest. Conversations about police accountability had spread far beyond Charlotte. His story had ignited a larger movement, one that wasn't just about him, but about the countless others who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored. Cameras flashed as he faced the sea of reporters waiting for a statement. He had given speeches before, but this one felt different. This wasn't about policy. It wasn't about damage control. This was about truth. The events of the past few weeks have exposed a reality that too many people already knew. He began. His voice was calm, steady. For some, this was a shocking injustice. For others, it was just another reminder of what they experience every day. What happened to me isn't unique, but the difference is, this time, the system couldn't bury it. The crowd was silent, hanging on to his words. I want to be clear, Marcus continued. This isn't just about firing bad cops or making small adjustments. It's about rebuilding trust from the ground up. It's about making sure that when someone sees those red and blue lights in their rearview mirror, they feel safe, not afraid. A murmur rippled through the crowd. That trust won't come back overnight, he admitted, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. My department is taking the necessary steps to ensure that what happened to me never happens again, to anyone. And I challenge every department across this country to do the same. A few hands shot up in the press section, but Marcus was done answering questions for now. He turned and walked back inside, knowing his words would travel far beyond this moment. The weeks passed, and though the protests died down, the movement didn't. Marcus's reforms took root. Officers who once resisted the changes found themselves under increased scrutiny. More bad cops were exposed, more systemic flaws uncovered. Community trust didn't return overnight, but for the first time in a long time, people saw that change was possible. Marcus wasn't naive. He knew this was just the beginning. The work of rebuilding, of holding the right people accountable, would be a fight that never truly ended. But for now, he had done what he set out to do. One evening, as he locked up his office and prepared to head home, this time without fear of flashing lights behind him, his phone buzzed with a message from his wife. Dinner's ready, no interruptions tonight. Promise. Marcus smiled. He had a lot of battles left to fight, but tonight, at least for a little while, he was just a man heading home. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, share it. Change starts with awareness, and awareness starts with conversation.